An original podcast from podlatino.com.
In 1985, for the first time in history, a significant portion of the planet watched the same images at the same moment. Not in a movie theater, not in a stadium, but in front of television sets switched on in homes across different continents. That year, live broadcast technology and the spread of cable television had reached a point where an event could cross the Atlantic in real time and arrive simultaneously in millions of households. And that power, for once, was used to sing. On July 13, 1985, two simultaneous stages, one at Wembley Stadium in London and another at JFK Stadium in Philadelphia, brought together the biggest names in pop and rock music of the moment. The concert was called Live Aid, and it was organized by Irish musician Bob Geldof, alongside singer Midge Ure. The purpose was straightforward: raise money to respond to the famine devastating Ethiopia for months. That day, Queen, David Bowie, Madonna, Paul McCartney, U2, and dozens of other artists performed. Estimates suggest that between 1.5 and 1.9 billion people followed the event on television around the world. The final total raised exceeded $50 million. The crisis behind Live Aid was not new. Ethiopia had been facing a combination of prolonged drought, civil war, and agricultural policies that had destroyed food production across vast regions of the country. In 1984, a BBC report broadcast images from refugee camps that shook public opinion across the Western world. The song "Do They Know It's Christmas," recorded at the end of that year by a group of British artists under the name Band Aid, had been the first step. Live Aid was the continuation on a larger scale. But critics, even at the time, pointed out something important. Music could generate awareness and raise money, but it could not replace structural policy or resolve the real causes of a humanitarian crisis of that magnitude. Aid arrived, but Ethiopia remained a country at war for years. The spectacle did not erase the complexity of the problem. While Europe and the Americas were watching the concert, another part of the world was living through its own crisis. On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 took off from Tokyo, bound for Osaka. It was a short route, barely an hour long. 12 minutes into the flight, an internal explosion destroyed the rear hydraulic system of the aircraft. The crew lost control. The Boeing 747 flew for more than half an hour without stable direction before crashing into Mount Ogura in Gunma Prefecture. Of the 524 people on board, 520 died. There were only 4 survivors. It remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history, a record that still stands decades later. 2 months after that, another disaster struck Latin America. On November 13, 1985, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia erupted. The heat released melted part of the snowcap covering the summit and triggered massive mud flows that rushed down the valleys at tremendous speed. The city of Armero, located more than 25 miles from the volcano, was buried in a matter of minutes. Approximately 23,000 people died. Scientific warnings about the danger had existed well in advance, but an effective evacuation never took place. The tragedy of Armero became one of the deadliest volcanic disasters of the 20th century and a lasting case study in risk management and institutional responsibility in the face of warnings that were there and simply not acted upon. That same year, Mexico lived through its own catastrophe. On September 19, 1985, an earthquake measuring 8.1 struck Mexico City in the early morning hours. Hundreds of buildings collapsed: hotels, hospitals, schools, homes. The official death toll was heavily debated. but the most credible estimates place the number of fatalities between 6,000 and 10,000, with tens of thousands more left without shelter. What happened after the earthquake proved just as significant as the quake itself. Faced with a slow and disorganized government response, Mexican civil society mobilized spontaneously and on a massive scale. Neighbors, students, workers, and volunteers from all walks of life organized rescue operations without waiting for instructions from the state. That burst of citizen action left a deep mark on the country's collective identity, and it is widely recognized as one of the direct precursors to the democratic transformation Mexico would undergo in the decades that followed. But 1985 also had a moment of wonder that came not from the present, but from the past. In September of that year, an oceanographic expedition led by researcher Robert Ballard located the wreck of the Titanic on the floor of the North Atlantic, roughly 12,500 feet below the surface. The ship had sunk in 1912, and for more than 7 decades, no one had been able to find it. The first images of the rusted hull, the sediment-covered staircases, the everyday objects scattered across the ocean floor, circulated around the world with a mixture of fascination and grief. The Titanic was never just a ship. It was a symbol of technological arrogance, of the inequality reflected in its casualty lists, broken down by passenger class, and of a disaster that had never stopped gripping the collective imagination across generations. Finding it was, in a way, closing one chapter and opening another. In offices and in bedrooms, a different kind of discovery was beginning to take shape. On November 20, 1985, Microsoft released Windows 1.0. It was not a full operating system in the strict sense, but a graphical interface that ran on top of MS-DOS and allowed personal computer users to interact through windows, icons, and menus, rather than typing text commands. The reception was modest. The computers of the time lacked the hardware to take real advantage of what it offered, and the interface had clear limitations. But Windows 1.0 was the first step in a trajectory that would, within a few years, fundamentally change how people worked and communicated. That wave of technological change was not limited to computers. Nintendo had launched its Famicom console in Japan in 1983, and by 1985, it was expanding into Western markets under the name Nintendo Entertainment System. That same year brought Super Mario Bros., a game that would define an entire generation. Video games were no longer just something you played at an arcade. They had moved into the living room, into kids' bedrooms, into the center of home entertainment. The entertainment industry was being reshaped from multiple directions at once. In movie theaters, 1985 delivered one of the most beloved films of the decade. Back to the Future, directed by Robert Zemeckis, opened in July and became an immediate phenomenon. The story of Marty McFly and Doc Brown, a DeLorean-turned-time machine, and a race against the clock to get back to the present, captured something essential about the spirit of that era. Nostalgia for the past, combined with genuine optimism about where technology was headed. Meanwhile, Madonna continued to dominate the charts with Material Girl and Like a Virgin, her image and her deliberate provocation redefining what a female artist could do and say in public. Music television, with MTV leading the way, had turned the music video into the most influential format in popular culture. While culture was expanding in every direction, the political map of the world was shifting in ways that were quieter but equally consequential. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, making him the leader of the second nuclear superpower on the planet. He was 54 years old, considerably younger than his immediate predecessors, and he arrived with a different read on the state of his country. The Soviet economy was showing unmistakable signs of structural exhaustion. The arms race with the United States was no longer sustainable. Gorbachev understood that something had to move. In November of that year, he traveled to Geneva to meet with Ronald Reagan in the first summit between the leaders of the two superpowers since 1979. No formal agreements came out of Geneva, but there was a conversation. After years of aggressive rhetoric and peak tension, two men sat down together and talked. In the context of the Cold War, that alone was a signal. 1985 was the year the world sang in front of a screen to help people it had never met. The year planes fell, volcanoes buried cities, and the earth shook beneath millions of feet. The year the ocean floor returned a ghost from the past, and a windowed interface offered an early glimpse of the digital future. The year a new leader arrived at the Kremlin, and two men who embodied decades of hostility sat across from each other for the first time. The Cold War continued. The world remained broken in many places, but something had shifted in the tone. The decade was not ending the way it had begun. Images traveled faster, voices carried further, and the decisions being made in Moscow and Washington were starting to feel, slowly, like they might lead somewhere different.